we have. All of us in our own way, Lord, we're longing for the waters of life. And come throw us into your river this morning and get us wet with you and wet with the truth and wet with your love, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today is the last day of this series about finding joy together, about naming and overcoming the things that keep us from loving and lasting relationships. And I don't know about you. For me, I have to say, it's been really good for me to write these messages and think through some of these questions because, I never think through my sermons, homilies, messages, whatever, talks, whatever you want to call them. I never think through them abstractly or separately from my own life. When I talk about these things in church, I'm thinking about my relationships. I'm thinking about, when I talk about the things in our hearts or whether or not we see people, I'm thinking about all those things with me. Am I on that kind of journey? And so for me, this has actually been really good. It has actually, I guess I'm the guy preaching this stuff, so I kind of know it in some sense. That's how I can bring it to the table. But I will say it has deepened my resolve about some of these things in my own relationships, in my friendships, my marriage, some of my relationships with extended family members. Samuel chapter 24. I think you'll like it. It goes like this. And now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told to him, take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. And then Saul took 3,000 chosen men. Saul is the rightful sort of king of Israel at this point. Then Saul took 3,000 men from all Israel, and he went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. Don't you love that? I like to live in a subdivision called the Rocks of the Wild Goats. So Saul came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. You know what that means, right? That's what it's saying, yes. So Saul went in to attend to his needs. If you didn't figure that out yet, think about it. And David and his men were staying by the openings of the cave. And then the men of David said to him, David, this is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. This is your chance to take Saul out, right here. And David arose, slipped into the cave, and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. His guys are saying, kill him. He's troubled because he snipped the little fabric. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. And David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped down with his face to the earth, and he bowed down. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men who say, indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you. But my eye spared you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord. He is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see, yes, the corner of your robe is in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of the robe and did not kill you, know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Saul goes into the cave to go on the toity. And David sneaks in and he cuts off a piece of his robe, and you kind of get the impression David's not quite sure what he's going to do at this point, and he's got his guys in the background saying, this is your big chance, just kill him. And you have to understand, Saul is still on the throne, but the prophet Samuel has already come to David, poured the oil over his head, anointed him, and said, you're actually the next king of Israel. So David already has been told by the greatest prophet in Israel, your God has appointed you king, but Saul is still on the throne, and David is this respectable guy. And so as he's going through this situation and he's piecing it together, he is coming to this place where he's saying, I cannot fathom killing Saul. He's not my enemy. He's not the greatest king, but he's not my enemy. And what he would really like is if Saul would stop trying to kill him, which is what Saul keeps doing. And if you read a couple chapters later, Saul does it again. Like Saul goes, yeah, you're right. You cut off my robe. You didn't kill me. It's all good. Why am I doing this to you? Why am I hunting you down? And then 2 chapters later, he's like, I got to kill David. What David wants is a conversation. And that's what he gets at this point. Long term, it doesn't really work out, as some relationships don't. But what he wants is a conversation with Saul. And so he goes in and he does this thing. And, I read this story, and did you picture the scene while I was reading it? Like, I wonder, how did he even pull this off? I mean, he snuck in there while Saul is, and he cut off a piece of his robe. But, guys are sometimes distracted when they're going to the bathroom. Some of you guys have been at O'Hare Airport in the bathrooms, and there's all these guys at the urinals on their cell phones. And I suppose I don't understand that. Like, you're doing that and you're talking on your phone. And I guess you could cut off a piece of their jacket or something. I don't know. But in this scenario, the question is about having a conversation with someone who seems to have pitted themselves against you and the decision to approach that person and try to have a conversation. And that's what David does. And here's the thing about courage in relationships. It takes far more courage to have that conversation where you try to work things out with someone than it does to simply just be done with the person and walk away. There is a time sometimes in relationships where you have to walk away, where you say, I've done everything I can, I can't, there's nothing good I can seem to make happen in this relationship. But oftentimes, our relationships are not yet to that point, but we still opt to be done with the person and walk away because the truth is it takes more courage. I mean, that's why there's been all these books in the last 10 years. I don't know if you look at sort of like the businessy section of bookstores, but there's all these books about hard conversations. Because you know what everybody's avoiding in life? Hard conversations. We get to the point where we say, boy, it's going to be a hard conversation with the person. Well, I don't think I really want to do that. And so it's easier to walk away. In friendships, and it happens in churches, when people walk away from the friendship, they usually tell themselves the other person has just done something too bad, or the situation is not fixable. But here's my observation. The hard conversation that might make working it out and the restoration of the relationship actually possible. There's another story, this one in the New Testament, that I like about relationship. It's in Acts chapter 15, and it goes this way. This is after, if you don't know what the book of Acts is, this is the story of the early church after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and the apostles are out going from village to village, and they're spreading the gospel, the message about Christ. And it says, after some days, Paul, that's the apostle Paul, said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. So they went to all these cities, they preached the gospel, they started all these churches. And Paul says to Barnabas, hey, let's backtrack now and go to all those places and see how all our fledgling groups of Jesus followers are doing. Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, who is called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take Mark with them, because he was the one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone ahead with them to do the work. And the confrontation between Paul and Barnabas became so sharp that they separated from each other. They could not agree about taking this young man with them. Paul said, we're not taking that young rat with us. And Barnabas said, we should take him with us. He's a good guy. And Paul said, he's not a good guy. He deserted us. And the disagreement became so sharp that they decided not to continue working together, to go different directions. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul took Silas and he departed. 15 years later, 15 years, Paul's writing one of his many letters that comprise much of the New Testament. He's writing this letter, 1 Timothy. And he's at the end of this letter, and he's writing to Timothy, and he's telling Timothy what he needs. He says, I bring my parchments, They didn't have Kindles yet. So he's like, bring my parchments and bring my cloak because it's getting cold. And he says, oh, and bring John Mark because he's helpful to me in my work. It's really interesting. That's the only other mention of what happened in this situation. 15 years later, we see Paul saying, no, I'm not still angry. I haven't written him off. I'm not done with him. So here Paul finds the courage to forgive, to let go of the grudge. He was pretty angry back there in Acts 15. Angry enough to say, well, then Barnabas, you and I can't work together anymore. I don't know if Paul decided that he'd been wrong about Mark 15 years earlier, or if he thought he'd been too tough, but there may have been involved here the courage we sometimes have to admit we were wrong. Are you able to do that? To look back at situations in relationships in your life and say, I maybe didn't navigate that the best way that I could. I may have been wrong in that situation. Can I tell you that in my younger years, and probably well into my 30s, I could almost never admit that I was wrong. You say, Pastor Fran, about what? About pretty much anything. Now, for me, it was because there was this sense of shame attached to it. If I was wrong about something, well, then that meant that I was the guy who blows it because I made the mistake, or I'm the guy who wasn't smart enough, or I was the leader who wasn't competent enough. And so I would navigate all kinds of things in relationships that would keep me from having to admit to myself or other people, yeah, I guess I was wrong about that. So I got a news flash for you this morning. You ready? Everybody's wrong sometimes. Everybody's wrong sometimes. You've been wrong before, and I know you probably don't want to believe this, but you're going to be wrong again about something. It is the nature of being finite human beings. And when I realized just how true that was, which I know it sounds silly, like you had to sort of realize and wake up to the fact that you weren't the only person who makes mistakes, who's wrong. Yeah, I did. And when I began to realize that, what happened was that I started finding the courage in my marriage and with my kids and in my friendships and leading the church to say, to actually say to people, I guess I was wrong about that, or I guess I made a mistake, and to say, I'm sorry about that, and then move on from there to, so what do we actually do? How do we make it better? What do we do about the situation or the thing that happened? Or, because if you're so busy fighting the ability to say that you made a mistake or that you were wrong, you never actually get to the thing of substance because you're so busy dodging and weaving that you're not really looking and saying, so I screwed up, but what do we need to do? What makes this a good situation now? What do we do with it? I shared this with the guys at our men's breakfast yesterday morning. Lynn and I read this series of mystery books, and they center around a protagonist named Inspector Gamache, who is the head of the Sûreté de Quebec. He's the head homicide investigator for the entire police force up in Quebec in Canada. And though Quebec usually wishes it wasn't part of Canada, but that's a whole other topic. And whenever Inspector Gamache hires a new person, so this is the guy who catches all the murderers, he's seen as the powerful guy. And whenever he hires somebody, he brings them in his office, and the first conversation goes like this. So that if you want wisdom in your life and in this job, you have to know these, you have to be able to say these 4 things. And I go, okay. He says, here they are. I don't know. I was wrong. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. And then he basically says, I'll see you tomorrow. And they're like, that's it? And he's like, yeah, because that's the stuff that keeps you from doing all that deflecting and never actually getting around to the thing that needs to be done. I thought it might be interesting this morning, because you probably don't know this, I try to picture you guys when I'm thinking about preaching. Like, what does this look like in their lives? So I thought it might be interesting this morning to ask you to think for a moment about where a time that you have needed courage in a relationship. Maybe you found that courage, or maybe you failed to find that courage. So I wonder if any of you can give like a one-sentence example of a time when you had to find the courage to do something, or to have a conversation, or even a time when you tried to find the courage, but, you failed to find the courage. Now, I'm asking you to really talk, maybe a few of you, and say, this is a time that because I want us to hear some examples of a time that you needed courage in a relationship. Otherwise, you're going to walk out of here and say, well, that was a sermon, and that was okay, and blah, 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 blah. But we're really talking about courage in our relationships. So I don't want you to overshare something that's too personal, but just kind of a general quick description. Could be in your marriage, could be in a friendship, could be someone in your extended family. Like finishing this sentence. I needed courage in my life in fill-in-the-blank relationship this one time that, whatever it was that was going on, that happened. How brave are you? You got an example of a time you needed courage in a relationship?
During my divorce.
During your divorce. What kind of courage did you need?
Just to accept the fact that I was wrong in some of these things, and that, it just wasn't one side, it was two people that made some mistakes.
Yeah. That takes courage. We don't always want to say, sometimes we want to say, you're the bad guy.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say similar but different. So courage didn't come for me till 20 years later when I had to go back to my ex and say, you know what, it wasn't you, it was me.
Mm.
And so courage and closure, because I could never close that chapter because I knew I was wrong until I had the conversation.
Man, did you guys all hear that? Going back to her ex 20 years later and saying, it wasn't you, it was me. She said, I couldn't have closure about that relationship till I admitted that, till I dealt with that. I've told you guys this before, that really religious sounding word in your New Testament, righteousness, that's all over the place, I really think the best translation of it is everything rightness. Because that describes the righteousness of God and the righteousness he's calling us into. That was everything rightness. You finally saw it, you owned it, you made it as right as it could possibly be made, and then at that point, everything was right as it could possibly be with that situation. And you said, okay, now the past can stop being the ghost that I'm dragging around with that. But else, courage you've needed in a relationship. A time you've needed courage in a relationship. Crystal.
Courage that I might lose the relationship with my father.
Mm. And what was the courage that you needed? Can you describe that? She said courage that she might lose the relationship with her father, who actually is a very good friend of mine. What was the courage needed?
To, I guess, go against what he was telling me I should do. Like, we were arguing, and he said, if you walk away, I won't talk to you ever again.
Mm.
And
Her dad said, if you walk away from this conversation, they were arguing, I won't ever talk to you again. But she had to have the courage to... See, that's another kind of courage that we have to have in relationships. Sometimes we have to have the courage to stand our ground, to say, no, this is what's right. This is what's true. Probably anybody who's been married knows that one. Thank you. Anybody else? Time you've needed courage in a relationship? Because I know you all have. I know not everybody wants to talk in front of a bunch of people in church, but I think we've made the point that these moments come in our relationships. Interestingly enough, in present relationships and in relation sometimes to past relationships, like the story of Paul and John Mark. At some point, I don't know what had happened, Paul rethought that thing. He let it go. And by the time we get to 15 years later, we get to 1 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's good with this guy. He's had closure. Bring Mark with you. It'll be great. We'll all do the work together. Sometimes we need courage when there is something next in a relationship, and we don't know what it is, but we feel called to step into it. You know what I'm talking about? Have you ever been there in a relationship? Like there's something next in a relationship, a place you know it needs to go, or something that needs to happen in that relationship. You might not even be able to clearly identify or articulate it yet, but you feel called to step into it. So it's kind of like stepping into uncharted territory, uncharted waters. I love the story after the resurrection when Jesus appears on the beach. I just told you this story in the last couple weeks, where Jesus appears on the beach, and when they realize it's him, Peter launches out of the boat because he wants to get to Jesus as fast as he possibly can. And when they get to the beach, Jesus has a fire going, and he's got breakfast on, which always kind of cracks me up, right? Because like everybody's thinking like, you just rose from the dead, and Jesus is like, I got grits. You know, you read John's gospel, it's casual. It's casual. They're on the beach. He's got a fire going. And he says to the guys, he says, hey, you guys should come have something to eat. You know, not like, hey, yeah, it's really me, I rose. He's like, you guys should come have something to eat. And John writes in his gospel, quote, none of them said anything. Jesus says, hey, come have something to eat. None of them said anything because they knew it was the Lord, which is a weird sentence, but it's John's way of saying that none of them had any idea what to do. Like, it's him, right? They saw Jesus arrested, beaten, executed, and now he's alive. He's on the beach with them, and he's cooking them breakfast. And I picture one disciple saying to the other disciple, so what happens now? Right? We did all that, and he's here, so what happens now? And the other guy said, I have no idea. No idea. But they know something happened. They know there's somewhere to go now. Jesus didn't do all this for nothing. Jesus didn't do all this because it wasn't going to change something. Jesus had been telling them for 3 years, you guys come and follow me. And so they're like, I don't know where this is going, but something is going to happen, and they're going to have the courage to step into it. When things feel uncertain in a relationship, but you know there's still more, it takes courage to walk into that unknown territory. This is my relationship with my little brother. I know he doesn't listen to my sermons, so I can talk about him. Now he'll probably somehow listen to this sermon, and I'll be in all kinds of trouble. But this is my relationship with my little brother. You know, I left home very young, a month after I turned 17, so we haven't lived at the same end of the country, for over 40 years. So my relationship with him, he was a little kid when I left. My relationship with him is when I go visit. He and I are the two kind of handy remodeler type brothers in the family. So the last few years we've been working on my mom's house out there together, gutting bathrooms and remodeling the kitchen and all this kind of stuff. But he keeps a distance with his heart. And then every now and then he goes, like every now and then he says something that makes you realize, oh, you actually do want a relationship with me. But then it's like 10 seconds, boom, And other than that, it's small talk. It's all on the surface. To use the name of the first sermon in this series, it's all above the waterline. There's no heart stuff. There's no vulnerability. There's no nothing. Very perfunctory answers to questions. But I know that under there, he wants to be loved. And he wants to be loved by his brothers. At least I'm pretty sure he wants to be loved by this brother. And I want to love him. But I don't know how we get there. And I don't know what it looks like. And it's definitely uncharted territory. So when I'm with him, and we're doing all the perfunctory things, swinging hammers and got the power saws out, and, talking about, the weather and, blah, 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 whatever it is we're talking about, I look for these little opportunities. Maybe not always in these words, but these little opportunities to somehow project to him, I love you. I'm interested in you. I want your life to be good. I want a relationship with you. But it takes me courage because he doesn't reciprocate 99 times out of 100. I could say something real warm, and his thing is like, hand me that pencil. I'm like, yeah, great. I know you love me too. But it takes courage. When you know there's something next in a relationship, it's easier. You know what? I've used this analogy for years. It's a really good analogy for this moment. People building relationships are often like two kids at the edge of a pool. and the water is a little chilly. And they're both saying to each other, you go first. No, you go. No, you go. No, you go. But here's the deal. The one who goes first in the relationship has to have the most courage. The one who says, no, I will go. I will extend myself a little more to you to send you that signal that it's safe for you, maybe even appealing for you, to extend yourself back a little bit toward me. Let me tell you what courage in relationships isn't. It's not bullying and intimidation, which, the way the world spins, sometimes looks like courage in the form of sort of bravado and overt strength. Courage is not that person who goes around saying, well, I just tell it like it is, and it isn't my problem if people can't handle it. I've known those people. Some of them have attended our church from time to time. And they've kind of gotten into this place in life where they have this idea that the best way for them not to get hurt is just to project, it's just like advance, advance, advance. Strong, strong, push, 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 criticize, criticize, whatever. And then if anybody says, that's really not your best relational tactic, they say, hey, not my problem if people can't handle it. Which is basically saying, I can rationalize literally everything I do in my behavior in relationships. So that works out pretty well. The person who acts that way and uses their words like barbs and jabs, they're actually a coward. Because the alternative to that is real conversation where they not only speak, but they do the hard work of listening. And the reason they operate the way they do is in part because they don't have the courage to have those real conversations or to listen to what the other person thinks or feels. What they're doing is they're keeping people at a safe distance from their heart. So I have 3 final little thoughts I want to share with you as we wrap this up today. The first is my confession. I still don't think I'm a very courageous person in relationships, but I'm always trying to become more courageous. I'm definitely more courageous than I was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. But I'm not sharing these things with you today to say, I have all this courage thing figured out. I pull it off easily. I don't. We call it courage for a reason. Second, something that keeps us from having courage is often, as it was for me many years ago, a sense of shame about ourselves. If you don't think much of yourself, you're going to have a hard time finding this courage and looking people in the eyes, whether it's looking them in the eyes with compassion to invite a good conversation, or whether it's looking them in the eyes to speak a hard truth to them. But I want you to know this morning that Jesus didn't die for junk. He died for good people who are made in the image of God. He died for you because you are of inestimable value. And we have to know this about ourselves, because if we go through life with this sense of shame, feeling we're sort of unworthy, then when the moments of courage are called for in our relationships, that sense of shame will say, see, you're not the person who can really say these things to people or can really pursue people or can really, and so you're going to be that person who just then shrinks away from maybe what might have been a very good move in a relationship. And third, I want to tell you that courage is not the absence of fear. I've sometimes thought in my life, when am I going to stop being afraid of certain things? I know we don't all walk around. We don't walk in here on Sunday mornings. You don't walk into your workplace and say to your coworkers, hey, let me tell you the 5 things I'm really afraid of in life. We don't do that. We don't talk about those things. We keep them hidden. But I have often thought in my own life, like, when will these kinds of situations or this kind of a situation in a relationship, when will this stop intimidating me? When will I stop being afraid? And I've realized at this point that courage is really not the absence of fear. It's the conviction about doing the right thing even when we are afraid. Or maybe another way to put it would be this. It's the conviction that the reason we would try to find that courage and have that conversation or do a certain thing in a relationship is because it's worth it. Because what's at stake is worth it. Because this marriage is worth it. Because this friendship and this person who is my friend is worth it. Because my little brother is worth it. So it's not the absence of fear. It's when you begin to realize this is all so important that even though I'm afraid, I'm going to ask God for help, and I'm going to reach down in my soul, and somehow I'm going to find the wherewithal to have that conversation, to reach out to that person, to offer this olive branch, maybe to speak the truth, but whatever it is. So don't wait until you never feel intimidated or never feel afraid to try to do something courageous in a relationship, because you might be waiting for decades before you get to that place. So why do we do all this? Why do we do all the things we've talked about in this series, like knowing our own hearts and motives? We talked about that. Learning to really see other people. That takes work sometimes for us to initially to wake up to that, but then also every day to have that sort of discipline, if you want to call it, to say, no, I'm really going to see these people. You know, today when I'm really with Katie Green, I'm going to see Katie Green. Today when I'm with my wife Linda, I'm really going to see Linda. Today when I'm with my friend Larry, I'm really going to see Larry. You know, letting God close enough to our hearts to bring healing. We talked about that. How can we do loving and lasting relationships if we're dragging all our wounds around with us for 20, 30, 40 years? Letting God close enough, that takes some work and some openness, or the work of forgiving people and working that out, or like we talked about last week, working to grasp the reality of grace and what that means and to be captivated by it so that all our relationships and our hearts and relationships can be suffused with this grace. Why work at all these things? Because it's work, right? If it wasn't, it's maybe not the only reason, but I was going to say if it wasn't, maybe everybody's relationships would all be great. But it takes these things. It takes this growth. And I think what it is that you have to come to believe that people are worth it. That's the end game. Jesus didn't come down here so you'd just believe all the right doctrines. He didn't come down here so you'd have some place to go on Sunday morning. He didn't come down here to just tell you to suck it up and be good and keep the rules. He came down here because people, to him, were worth it. And I think you have to come to believe, if you want to really grow in these ways, which will make some new things possible in your relationships, you have to come to believe that people are worth it, and you have to come to believe that the opportunity to experience love and joy with other people is worth it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you have those moments, when you have those moments in a relationship that's, and hopefully you have some relationship in your life that's like, but a relationship that's open and whole and healthy, could be your spouse, could be friends, could be whatever. And sometimes when I'm in the moment of love and joy with people, with Linda or with a group of friends, I think, this is the end game right here. This is what God was trying to get to when he sent Jesus, was to restore our relationships so we could walk together in love and know this joy of the wholeness of the fabric of our hearts and relationships together. And I think that if you come to believe that people are worth it, and you come to believe that the opportunity for love and joy, to experience love and joy with people is worth it, then I think maybe you're willing to do the things that we've talked about for 6 weeks and to try to grow in those ways. And I think if we don't try to grow in those ways, all of those ways are part of what it means to follow Jesus. If we don't try to grow in those ways, then we may find ourselves in, 30 years looking back and saying, so how come I didn't end up with more good relationships? How come I couldn't, And again, can you fix every relationship? No. Not every marriage, not every friendship. Absolutely not. But if we grow in these ways, we will change what we bring to the table of every relationship. And somewhere, as that unfolds down the road, it's going to pick up steam, and we're going to find ourselves with some good friendships. We might find ourselves with a better marriage or a better romantic relationship. We might find ourselves with some better relationships with our brothers and our sisters and our moms and our dads and our kids. And my prayer for you at the end of this series is that you would long to grow in these ways. Your Bible says love is the end game. That's the thing it's all moving toward. Let's pray. Lord, you know our hearts, you know our wounds, you know our ups and our downs, the things we get. You know the things that I get, and you know the things that I don't get yet. And you come to us and you call us to an open-heartedness. You call us to a willingness to think about our hearts and our lives. You call us to a willingness sometimes to see hard things. And you call us to get a vision for what it means to be able to move toward another human being with a good heart, with a good intention, with the warmth of love, with desire for good things for them. And my prayer for us is that you would help us take this journey. That you would help us grow and grow and grow. So that we become those people that somebody wants to be married to, that somebody wants to date, that somebody wants to be friends with. We become those people that our kids actually want to be with, that our brothers and sisters in the families we grew up in say, you know, there's something good about you. Grow us into those people, God. Because all the places that you lead us lead to joy. And we are grateful. I thought since this is the end of the series, we might do something a little different at the end of this series. I'm going to ask you to stand up. I thought we might mark the end of this series about relationships in a little different way. Usually we just get to the end of a series and we just say, well, that's that series, and Pastor Fran will go on to something new. The joy of relationships is one of God's greatest gifts to us, but it can be daunting, as you know. All that goes into walking in love with one another as human beings. So I thought as a way of affirming in God's presence this morning that we desire to grow in these ways, that we desire to be people who grow more in our ability to do relationship well and to love well, and to say to the Lord this morning in His presence, to say a big yes to the value of human beings and the worthwhile nature of seeking love and joy in relationship with others, that maybe the way to sort of put a cap on that would be just to put our hands together as a way of saying yes to all of this. God, this is who we want to be. Would you do that with me this morning?
Yes.